Hi, everyone. It's Charlie O'Donnell again from Brooklyn Bridge Ventures, and welcome back to another Lunchtime StackUp. We are going to talk about refactoring humans with domain-driven design. I have the vaguest of perceptions as to what that's going to entail. But that's why we've brought Ben to be the expert. Ben's the CTO at MANTL in the fintech space. And Ben, I'll get out of your way and let you share what you've got.
Cool. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. I have some slides, so I'll go over to them, and it's gonna become a infinite loop of screens. So just do this.
Okay.
All right, I'm screen sharing, and let's present this. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Cool.
Although actually your screen looks like another participant. It's not full screen sharing. So I could see your screen.
How about now?
Yeah, it's right next to you. It's a different look, but I think we can go with it.
Okay. Cool. Well, as long as you can see the title slide, that's good. So again, I'm Ben Conant. I'm the CTO and co-founder of MANTL. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about domain-driven design and how we have implemented domain-driven design at MANTL, some of the things we've learned along the way. And the title of the talk is really Refactoring Humans with domain-driven design. And the reason for that is that I think there's this sort of prevailing thought in the industry that domain-driven design is really it's a code thing, right? This is something that engineers are concerned with. It goes into how you're structuring your data and how your backend system works and all of that stuff. And as soon as you start hearing about domain-driven design, you start hearing about command, query, responsibility, segregation, event-driven architecture, distributed transactions, and a whole host of other things that are important things and inform how we build stuff at MANTL. But today I'm going to kind of pull back from that, and I'm going to talk about how domain-driven design is actually, I think, primarily a human thing, right? This is a system. It's a very well thought through set of strategies for helping humans work together on software. And through implementing domain-driven design, we kind of figured that out through a sort of backdoor process. So, if you're like us and you're thinking about implementing something like domain-driven design, you might think about the benefits of implementing domain-driven design. And most of the benefits that you'll hear about are for your code, right? Your code is going to be more understandable, more extensible, better documented. It's going to be able to handle edge cases way better. That's one of the main selling points that you'll kind of hear, like, if you have full DDD in operation, like edge cases kind of solve themselves. That's a big selling point. And all of these are to varying degrees true. But what we actually learned is that for your humans, domain-driven design is going to help them solve problems faster, like each other more, and be happier at work. So I have kind of learned and discovered through this process that I'm going with the right-hand side of this equation every time. And the benefits that you get with domain-driven design for how people work together are pretty great. So before we get too deep, I think it's good to just have a background in like what is domain-driven design, in case you're sitting here and you're like, what is this guy talking about? I have no idea what domain-driven design is. Domain-driven design was first articulated in a book by Eric Evans, who's a pretty famous software architect. And it is really, it encapsulates years and years of experience attempting to build large enterprise software systems that solve a lot of use cases and that really are very complicated, because the things that humans do are very complicated, right? And it is stack agnostic, right? So domain-driven design, don't let someone tell you that you need to refactor your Go microservices into Rust microservices in order to do domain-driven design. You don't, so that person is lying to you. It is more of philosophy of code than it is about any specific set of technologies that you need to use. And for the purposes of what I'm saying, sort of in my own words, domain-driven design is a strategy for software design that emphasizes building a deep understanding of the things that exist and how those things interact. And this understanding, we want it to be shared between the humans who are interacting with the software and the source code itself, right? So that's important. We're building a deep understanding of the problem that we're trying to solve, and then we're sharing that understanding between the code and the actual humans who are working on the software. So brief plan, I'm going to talk about why we use domain-driven design at MANTL. Why did we make that choice? Then I'm going to kind of have a sales pitch for it. I'm going to say, why should you think about domain-driven design, even if you think it's too much overhead, even if you think there's no way we could have all of that process and jargon in our workflow, and you don't have time to think about it. I think it's really worth implementing. I'm then going to talk about some strategies that domain-driven design gives that are pretty simple and human-based for unlocking value. And you don't need to implement the whole thing, right? So this is how can I unlock up value in my org with just a little bit of DDD. Then I'm going to do wrap up and QA. So let's start. I think, why do we use domain-driven design at MANTL? Why did we make that choice? Well, I think to answer that, you have to kind of go into what is MANTL. MANTL's a fintech company. We're based here in New York, though these days we are fully remote. And we are reimagining banking infrastructure. So our customers are actually small and medium-sized banks and credit unions across America. And we actually provide technology to them to operate their bank. So our flagship product is account opening, meaning that if you were to go to www.openanaccount.bank.com, you might land on MANTL software. You won't know that MANTL exists because it looks like the bank's brand, and it's opening accounts in an automated way at that bank for that bank, right? So it's a little, you can already start to see some of the complexities that we might be dealing with. And we really prioritize UX as a company, not just from a design standpoint, but also from an engineering standpoint, right? So everything that goes into, an end user experience that feels slick and modern, and you get things like people can sign up for a new bank account in under 3 minutes, right? Which in the world of the banks that we work with is pretty unheard of. So the way that I explain MANTL to myself and the way that our engineering and product organization kind of thinks of it is MANTL is really Shopify, but for banks, right? So in the same way that Shopify helps a small to medium-sized retailer sell stuff online and provides all of the technology, you don't need an engineering department to set up your e-commerce store. And Shopify has grown to help with point-of-sale systems and inventory management and all that stuff. MANTL does that same thing, but instead of for the domain of e-commerce and retail, we do it for the domain of banking. Right? So cool. That's what MANTL is. That's what we're about. Why do we use domain-driven design? Well, our platform, MANTL's platform, aims to solve banking, and not just for one bank, right? Generically for any bank with any set of configurations. That's what our mission is. And it turns out that banking is really, really complicated. You have lots of different financial products, right? Lots of different types of financial products, all sometimes interacting together. You've got lots of different relationships between people and those products, right? It's not the case that just one person owns an account. Maybe one person is related to an account. There's a business that actually owns it, and then there's a couple other people that play specific roles on the business that are important, right? And you've got lots of different rules to account for, right? So, who can have what product, what happens when this balance goes up or down, and all of that needs to be rolled into something. And so domain-driven design is this battle-tested framework for translating complex human activities into elegant software that is extensible and comprehensible or understandable to the people who are writing it and the people who are interacting with it. So that's why we chose domain-driven design. But now I'm going to talk a little bit about why you should think about it, right? Like maybe you're not doing what we're doing. Maybe you are in the business of processing billions of analytics events, and like there isn't actually a complex human domain to work at. Well, I think what we've learned through implementing domain-driven design is that it doesn't really matter what you're doing. Domain-driven design is running things behind your back, right? So every team is doing some form of domain-driven design to some extent, right? They are carving up the world into, the things that exist and how they interact. And when unmanaged, this results in this state called warring domains, right? And so warring domains is bad. It results in symptoms like engineers and product managers are talking past each other, right? You have knowledge towers in your organization where specific people are the go-to people and you have to go to them and they know how everything works and otherwise you can't get anything done. And mistrust between departments, right? So product and design are kind of at each other's throats and they don't understand each other, right? So I could talk a lot about the problem of warring domains and why it is a problem and like that, but I actually, a product manager at MANTL showed me this video and I think it does it the best justice. So I'm going to play a little bit of it now.
There's one feature.
And we'll start at like the 8th second.
Understanding this, why is it so hard to display the birthday date on the settings page? Why can't we get this done this quarter?
Look, I'm sorry, we've been over this. It's the design of our back end. First we have to call the bingo service. See, bingo knows everyone's name-o, so we get the user's ID out of there. Then from bingo, we can call papaya and MBS to get that user ID and turn it into a user session token. We can validate those with OldNop, and then once we have that, we can finally pull the user's info down from Raccoon.
Yeah, but couldn't the Raccoon team basically just...
No, Raccoon isn't guaranteed to have that info. Before we do this, we have to go to Wingman, do a query to see if the user is willing to take it to the next level, or if they're just playing the field. Now, Wingman is cool, but he doesn't store any user info himself. He has to reach out to other user info provider services, like RGS, Barbie Doll, Ringo2, BLS. But how does it know what all the user provider services are? Well, for that, it has to go to Galactus, all-knowing user service provider aggregator. And while Galactus has omniscient knowledge of all current user info providers, it doesn't have future sight or knowledge of past user info providers.
Cool. So that's obviously a bit of caricature. And I think, you've got really two well-meaning people trying to build some software together. You've got a kind of product manager with a admirable goal of getting a birth date on a settings page. And then you've got an engineer who actually kind of seems pretty brilliant, right? Like pretty senior back-end engineer. This might be a pretty expensive conversation to be having, who is very good at explaining why this thing can't happen and going into this sort of the layers of complexity there. And I guess one of the things that I'm arguing is that this is really bad, and you don't want this, right? And this is what happens when things are unmanaged, and that domain-driven design can really help. So what we just saw is this state of warring domains, right? It's the natural state of software development where different functional roles, right? Product, design, engineering, are phrasing the solution in their own language. The solution meaning your product, your technology, the things that exist that you have created to power your business. And so you have, a world in which product has phrased the solution in its own language, right? And you could imagine product as being this globe that marks things that are important. It's very functional. It's pre-organized. You get design, which adds another layer onto the picture. And maybe this is more digestible for the end user and helping them figure out exactly what they need to do and how they should use the thing. And then you get engineering, which is the same picture, right? We're talking about the same thing, but we're going into layers that are complicated and arcane for product and design, right? And so when the different functional roles are allowed to talk about the product, you get this sort of hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil within departments, right? So product has its way of understanding things, design has its way of understanding things, engineering the same. And that is when, people start to get very frustrated with each other, right? So product sort of conceptualization of the birth date as a specific thing which needs to be on a specific page, that's frustrating to the engineer because the engineer is like, well, it's not that simple. There's like a million things that we need to do. How could you not understand that, right? And so what domain-driven design does for any organization, whatever they're doing, is, almost at its core, it helps us speak the same language between these departments and even between these departments and customers, so that everyone can be using the same map, so to speak, and be working happy and contributing, right? And it provides some tools to allow that to happen. And you'll notice that this map is way more high touch than any of the previous maps, right? This is a Google map, but it gives every department what they need, right? So it's more work to maintain and to create, but it does sort of have this massive benefit in communication. So now I'm going to chat a little bit about how you can unlock value with just a little bit of domain-driven design. So one of the other things about domain-driven design is that as you get into it, you sort of start thinking, man, like I have to implement this whole thing to get the true benefits of it. And I think that's just not true. So we'll go into a few things that you can do to start seeing some of these benefits. So domain-driven design is a whole field of study. This is one of many famous maps that sort of talk about what domain-driven design is and how to implement it and like that. But I'm not going to talk about most of these things, so don't worry. I am just going to talk about one of them, and that is the ubiquitous language. And I would argue the ubiquitous language is at the core of domain-driven design. So if you can get to a place where people are using a ubiquitous language, you are going to have, a relatively easy time layering in the rest of domain-driven design principles. So a ubiquitous language is a common, rigorous, human language that is used by everyone involved with the software. Simple enough, until you start to think about what that actually means. And what it means is this, right? You need to have your product managers, your designers, your executives, your engineers, all speaking the same sort of structured set of terms to each other so that they can talk about the model of your solution. And not only is it how we speak to each other about the product, right, in whiteboarding discussions or over Slack or whatever, it also makes its way into the application code itself, right? So you have to be kind of tracing this language all the way from whiteboarding discussions through to the concepts that end up in the application code and also in the specs and documentation. And once you get to this point or a point that's close to this point, things really start to click for people, right? Designers, engineers, product managers are all kind of on the same page and talking about the same things. And that's a really good place to be. So domain-driven design gives three sort of strategies for achieving this, which are event storming, domain storytelling, and knowledge crunching. And those are the ones that I'm going to cover and talk about how you can implement pretty easily. Before we dive fully into them, we have to sort of understand, okay, ubiquitous language, like what problem does that solve? Like how might I think of a problem that I might apply a ubiquitous language to? So this is a really good cartoon that describes it. Here you have, let's just imagine it's a legacy piece of software that you inherited or you want to upgrade your system, right? So you have this piece of software. It is doing a lot of things for a lot of people. It's spitting out errors. There are no stack traces, and everyone is very upset, right? You might also think about this robot as a new process that you need to write software for, and nobody is really sure how to talk about yet, right? Same things apply. So these processes and carving out a ubiquitous language is the first step to getting to a better place where you've sort of phrased the solution in a way where each piece of the solution is very well defined, understood by everyone, and keeping people happy, and nothing is trying to do too many things. So event storming, this is a structured meeting between engineers, designers, domain experts, product managers, and it helps you pull out the events that happen, right? It's really, it simplifies this process by saying, hey, tell me the things that happen during this process. Then you can pull out terms and problem areas, and you can lead yourself to a rough cut, a sensible solution. So in this example, right, events, this is easy stuff. Orders are taken, drinks are made, drinks are served, we request checks, and so on. From these events, we can start to pull out terms for our ubiquitous language. So orders, drinks, checks, and the table that everyone is on. And we can also highlight problem areas, right? People don't pay the check, we make the wrong drink, we have to remake it. A customer takes a really long time to decide what they want. And from there, you can pull out a sensible solution looking at that data, right? You've got a drink maker, you've got a server, you've got a cleaner, they're all doing different things. And almost more important than what the actual sensible solution is and what the events are and the terms are, is that you did it together, right? And now each one of the functional roles are bound to use this language and evolve this language together. It's not like just engineers in a room pulling this out and then no one knows what they're talking about for the rest of the project. As an augment to event storming, domain storytelling is also super helpful. This is another structured meeting, same type of size, and it helps you build a shared model of the process. So you kind of walk your domain expert, customer, product manager, whoever it is, and you say, all right, well, what's the first step in this process? Customer walks into a bar, they order a drink, someone takes their order, another bartender picks it up, and you keep going like this, step by step by step. And as you're going step by step by step, you are building a model that everyone can see of the process, right? Customers, servers, drink makers, order box, bar seat, cleaner. Like you kind of make these things up, but you make them up in a shared way and on a shared surface, so that in the future, you will talk about these things with the same terms. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, knowledge crunching, right? And this is the one that we're biggest on at MANTL. And event storming and domain storytelling are a way to start off on your ubiquitous language. Knowledge crunching is a little bit different in that, it is a continuous meeting that happens for the lifetime of the software. And it really happens, it never ends. It's called as needed, typically by engineers who are coming up against, or designers who are coming up against the edges of your language, right? We don't have language to talk about this. The model doesn't solve this for us. Let's evolve this and make changes to our ubiquitous language, our application code and our specs and documentation in this type of meeting. And it obviously allows changes. So that's the sort of three techniques that domain-driven design kind of gives us to formulate our ubiquitous language. Lastly, I think just to summarize, right, the things that we learned by implementing domain-driven design at MANTL really is that every team is doing something like this to some extent, but it leads to confusion and clash that we call warning domains. Just a little bit of domain-driven design can really help to solve this problem. And most people think of domain-driven design as an engineering thing. And that's not true. It's really like a whole product organization thing and even a whole company thing when you start talking about customers and having them understand the software. I really don't like it when people sort of say that this is great and whatever, and they don't have any data to back it up, even if it's just anecdotal. So I'll leave off with some of the feedback that we started having before we implemented domain-driven design that I just sort of pulled from our retrospectives. We were hearing things like, we need to stop with the just ping X engineer mentality across the company. We acknowledge that this person is valuable, but we've got stuff to do and this is getting in our way, right? We need to be better at understanding problems and documenting the problems we're trying to solve before we start stuff. Digging into difficult pieces of the app is hard. And finally, we need to remove bottlenecks. And that kind of turned into this, which is that, cross-team communication is actually amazing to see. The system is clicking, and knowledge crunch documentation has been great. So it really does work. It's giving a shot to. And with that, I'm out.
That's awesome. I have a question just about implementation, especially when you jump into stuff like nomenclature. Is this the kind of thing that's easier to do? It seems easier to do at the beginning of a project versus, if I walked into any kind of sizable engineering organization now, I'd almost be worried that okay, I know you call that server that thing, I know you call this thing this, but it almost feels like we have to change everything. What's the sort of way to what's the narrow point of the wedge here for people who are thinking about incrementally improving and getting to this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it can feel like, oh, this has to be top down and we have to do this from the start. And I think actually one of the things that I'm saying is that you shouldn't feel too stressed out to get started. So in the most micro agile way, right, this can start on a specific agile scrum team, for example, right? Mm-hmm. And it can start with the engineering manager or the product manager just saying, cool. In the same way that we enforce putting story points on all tickets before we, pick them up for work, right? That's just a social contract that we have. We are going to enforce that all of the tickets are written in this language. And I've taken a first cut at 20 nouns that we use to talk about our thing, right? And if that can create clarity on that team for that squad, it can then maybe apply to the adjacent squads and grow organically from there. Once people start to get a taste for how much better the communication can be, it becomes somewhat contagious.
Do you think the cross-team communication has been harder in a period of being remote?
So I really thought it would be. Before we went through sort of going remote and like that, I was very concerned that the cross-team communication would be bad, the human sort of oh, I'm walking by your desk, let's have a chat kind of thing would go away and would be really hard. What we found is that I think it's really gotten better. For one, we were sort of 1/4 distributed and 3/4 in the office before the pandemic hit. And we had a lot of sort of IT problems where, people who were remote, they weren't able to really hear what was going on in the room, or we couldn't hear them, or their internet would cut out. And forcing everyone to sort of be on the same playing field in terms of being on meetings and like that has helped. And I also think that our culture has evolved to be way more specific about writing in shared Slack channels and writing very specifically. And that has really helped cross-team communication. So that was surprising, but a good thing ultimately.
Who's ultimately the owner? Do you have a full-time head of product? Who's ultimately the enforcer of hey, remember we said we were going to go use this specific language, or this doesn't fit? Who's in charge of implementing it?
So that's another great question. I think for us, we actually started off with this table of terms and definitions that lived in Notion, which we use for our internal documentation. And that became stale pretty quickly. So we don't have a book that we throw at people. What we do have and what's keeping us alive, and we'll iterate and get better on this, but our ubiquitous language lives in our source code, right? So MANTL operates with a monorepo, and all of the elements of our domain are named what they are named when we talk about them in the source code. So we talk about people and businesses and applications and like that, and the relationships in between them. And that is actually in the source. And that is super beneficial because it kind of enforces that, even if you have this grand plan and you have this big book of terms, right? Like the source code can go awry very, very quickly. But when the backbone of it is in the source code, you're in a good spot.
Gotcha. Cool. One last question, but I also don't want to hog up the Q&A. So if anybody wants to jump into the chat or ask a question, feel free. Do you, when implementing this and thinking about, as you put up, you guys are hiring and always looking for good people, does it change what you look for in people's ability to communicate or a certain more collaborative kind of approach? Like, should organizations who think about doing this have a different filter on new people?
Yeah, I think that's another great question. We definitely, both through what we expect out of people internally and the type of people that we hire, like for engineers, for example, we want to hire very product-minded engineers who are very communicative and into solving these sort of complexities with the product, right? So we definitely do screen for that, and I think that if you want to get serious about implementing DDD, you do need to kind of change maybe your perception on, well, your product managers are going to need to become maybe a little bit more technical, and your engineers are going to need to definitely prove that they have strong written communication and can talk about the domain model and get back and forth on it and get that.
Gotcha. Cool. Well, that was super helpful, and it actually almost makes me think a little bit about what domain-driven processes would be like for fundraising in venture, because I can't tell you how many pitches I get where plain language is missing, and I can't always understand what I'm being pitched. And so I think there's something to be said for everybody using some basic event-driven knowledge that any reasonable person can understand in their business pitches. So I don't think it just applies to building technical products, but thanks so much for spending the time with us, and good luck and continued great work with MANTL.
Cool. Thanks so much.
All right, thanks.